Well, welcome, and how exciting to have a new conference player in town and a new bunch of people to talk to, really, because I guess historically in the last few years we haven't had a lot of variation here. We participated in the Innoxcell conference in Singapore last year, and we were very impressed, and a great turnout. And equally here we've got a similarly good turnout. We're very excited about that. We were reflecting on our market and similar markets, and a conversation came up about genomics, and we were looking at the fact that 5 years ago to sequence one genome it cost $1 million, and it took considerable amount of time. As of today, you can sequence a genome for $1,000 and it takes you about a week. So we were thinking about, well, how does that dovetail into what we're talking about in the eDiscovery space? And I guess, you know, on one level, we're creating a whole lot of extra information as businesses and as people who go into legal cases and take actions and defend actions. So that's part of, you know, I guess part of how our market grows. But on another level, we've got a whole lot of information, and Ian touched on it briefly, that, you know, we're starting to make a lot more out of, and we're making a lot more out of that information by using analytics. And, you know, 15 years ago, Dolphin Search, and there might have been maybe a 10x around 15 years ago, there were very few players in the market charging a huge amount of money. Now the analytics as a technology is really a matter of course, and certainly very easily available to the average matter. So we've seen dramatic changes there. The other area that I thought was interesting in relation to the genomics comparison was around audio. Now, we've had audio recordings forever, right? And over the last, I guess, 5 years, the nature of what exists in audio is now accessible to us from a search perspective. You know, we've got the Nexidias and, it's going a bit louder, we've got Nexidias and Intelligent Voice and some of these other technologies that's now becoming much more accessible. And so we're seeing in our, that's very loud now, we're seeing in our market a whole lot more information that's available to create arguments for or against a particular action. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology journey and the evolution of technology. And I was doing a bit of research, and, you know, we always go to Gartner or IDC or Forresters or any of the research companies, and there's a great graph here. I don't know if you can read that on screen. And it talked about the cycle for emerging technologies, and I love this idea of the peak of inflated expectation. And 10 or 15 years ago, that really was, I guess, where analytics was, this great notion of what could be done. And, you know, as we go through the innovation trigger into this peak of inflated expectation, through the trough of disillusionment, and we come out the other end where we're actually practically start using the technologies. And again, on the analytics side, we're certainly seeing that very much so now. And some really interesting things in there, right? And something that I'll talk about in a moment around cloud computing, which is clearly a big thing that's impacting our market at the moment. The technology adoption curve, you've probably all seen this. We were sort of reflecting on how certain elements of what we do on the eDiscovery space are now pretty much the expected norm. But certainly, and more particularly regionally, things like computer-assisted review are still very much in the early stages, and we're going to hear about a bit more about, and hopefully a lot more about that in the next section, or next segment. Okay, so the global eDiscovery environment is, you know, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's constantly changing. We've got a whole lot of data privacy questions. I mean, we opened in Singapore the year before last, and, you know, there've been a whole lot of questions that have come up. You know, we've got information hosted in the cloud there. We've got customers from outside of Singapore who are, you know, quite particular about data privacy, etc. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics. There's Safe Harbour is going through that whole transition at the moment between the EU and the US. And I'm not even sure if they've ratified the new standard or not. There's probably some people in the room that's fairly familiar with that. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the market that are constantly changing that we need to be aware of. I thought I'd look at some primary data from IDC. They're saying that the eDiscovery market's now worth $10 billion. That's a big number. The interesting part for me there is that only $2 billion of that is software, and the other $8 plus is services. Which is interesting in the sense that we often do focus on the technology, and I'll be doing a bit of that today. And the services component is the fastest growing. So it's significantly growing. And we'll talk about how the software vendors are moving into that space to a certain extent in a bit. Forecast to reach 14.7 billion by 2019, so that's not stellar growth, but it's very solid. Europe represents 23% of that and growing, and Asia a very small part of that. Analytics companies seen as a major threat to the existing market. That's again just straight out of the IDC report. And there is significant market consolidation. Of course, you can read that in the press every day. There's lots of companies being acquired, with some of the big players getting a lot bigger. Now, we don't have a lot of primary data for the local market, so I thought I would share some information from Cura, who are one of the largest players, and I guess probably the largest, although I'm sure that would be argued by somebody. So I won't say it. I'll say it's big. And Relativity have got something like 130, 140,000 seats installed or actively used worldwide, which is a pretty big number. When we break that down into the Asia-Pac market, if we look back at the slide a moment ago, where IDC talked about Asia being 7% of the eDiscovery market, for Cura, one of the biggest players, Asia is only half of that. So it's around the sort of 2-3% mark. So what does that tell us? Well, it could tell us a few things, I guess. We could deduce that we're not using technology to the same extent, or we've got regional issues about how Relativity is sold into the market. But regardless of that, at least it's some primary data that we can say is factual. And the interesting part there is that 40% of the installed base of Relativity is Australia and New Zealand. And then you can see the numbers dropping away beyond that. Now, there's been discussion about Japan being considered one of the biggest potential markets in the region. But nonetheless, it does show that we play a pretty important part of the market from an eDiscovery perspective in Relativity's world here in Australia and New Zealand. So, what are the key drivers to our market? Well, big data. Ian talked about big data, and big data to me is a bit of a throwaway line in a sense, but there's a hell of a lot more evidence that we're having to deal with. There are more layers to the evidence that we can deal with through audio and through applying analytics. The volume of documents, certainly isn't getting any smaller. And of course, the data type, again, coming back to audio and even from a database perspective, we do a lot of work around discovery inside of accounting databases and what have you. And ultimately, though, my view on the market here, and really generally, is that it's up to the service providers like us to be providing use cases that make sense. If we can provide use cases that stack up from a legal perspective and a risk perspective, and of course a cost perspective, then that'll accelerate the adoption of whatever technology we're putting forward. But ultimately, there are a lot of technologies out there that broadly do a similar thing. If we can overlay relatively risk-aware processes over these technologies, that technology becomes secondary to the process and the service provided. So one of the other things we talked about, there's always a natural tension between buyer and seller in any market. And in the market that we play in, there are a number of unusual dimensions in the sense that we're largely providing our services to law firms, which is different to the US, where it seems that the larger or predominant share of the market is derived directly from in-house counsel. And so in our market, we've got us as the seller, the law firm as the buyer of our services, and the law firm's client as the buyer of that technology. So the difficulty for us in terms of proselytising these new use cases and new technologies is that we've got to go down through a number of different paths before the value proposition makes it to the end client. And the larger firms are very switched into the great technologies and are much more committed to using these technologies, and smaller firms generally, I know this is a generalisation, but tend to be more risk averse, reasonably so, because they haven't done the same number of matters, they haven't seen the risks and experienced the risks. So for us to push some of these technologies becomes probably harder than in other markets. So the seller predicts the need, creates the technology and use cases, and the buyer determines the demand. So obviously we've got to create these use cases that are effectively packaged and effectively communicated so that they can roll right through the buying process. And I believe that the role of the vendors and service providers is evolving in the sense that we're moving away from this notion of constantly selling technology, but rather selling use cases, necessarily. There was an observation made in the IDC report that there's significant consolidation of companies and technologies and service providers. So the actual technology providers are realising that for growth there needs to be the delivery of some service. Again, referring to some information out of Kcura at an executive briefing they had recently, and this is interesting for me because this is a technology provider's view on the technology market. So this isn't my view, but it certainly aligns to a certain extent with mine. But Kcura reflect on the current main players in the market, of which there are a number. And remember, this is a sort of a global perspective from a major supplier. And they looked at three dimensions of those providers, whether they are on-premise, so did they offer an on-premise install, do they offer cloud services, SaaS type arrangement, and do they provide services? And of the current crop of providers, look, it could be argued that maybe some of these sit in different areas, but all of the main providers today are all on-premise providers. Ranging in whether they go into the cloud or not, ranging whether they give services or not, or do services. So this is the main competitors to Kcura and their relativity in their view. The emerging competitors, of which we've seen a lot of them, and some of them are very, very impressive. All of them pretty much exist in the cloud and offer services. So it's clearly a different strategy that the emerging competitors are focusing on. So, whether it's right or not, of course, it's not the observation here, it's just more of a what is. The Everlaw, I think, is being represented by a local provider now. We've looked at a number of these other players, and some of them are pretty strong. And certainly, offer an excellent user experience in many cases. Kcura then looked at what they consider the edge competitors. So what are the longer term competitors that are going to change their market? And we're going to talk about Office 365 in a moment because that seems to be a big area of interest for Kcura, and certainly one for us as well, because we're seeing a lot more requirements for collections through Office 365. Barracuda, Proofpoint, HP, they've got a couple of options there. Druva, Box, IBM / Stored IQ. I mean, there's a few technologies in some of those larger companies' mixes, but they're pure cloud players. Long term, I think from a Kcura's perspective, they really want to make sure that they're ready to deal with that emerging approach to the market. So I wanted to talk briefly about cost, risk and innovation. And for me, these are the three things that have got that sort of tension in any deal. And there's obviously a barrier to, the key barrier to innovation in our market is risk. A very small mistake or a small miss can have massive ramifications in a matter. So, cost often is a driver for the use of electronic technology simply because it's way cheaper. Sometimes it's an excuse without risk assessment. From my view, the lines between these three are often inappropriately drawn or ill-considered. And certainly not suggesting that we've got the perfect answer in every situation, but there are so many dynamics in play there that the more consideration of those three elements and where you're sitting on the continuum of each is very important to consider when making decisions on technology. So I wanted to talk about Microsoft and E5, and we've been watching this with interest since Microsoft acquired Equivio some time ago now, and we were a big Equivio user. I guess the timing was interesting with Equivio. They managed to sell to Microsoft just when all the other technology providers were starting to kill their market. So it was a very smart and well-timed play on their part. So this new Office 365 SKUs, who's heard of E5? I'm just curious to know what who's across it, technology providers, so that would make sense. So let me talk briefly about it. So Office 365, as you probably know, is Microsoft's offering in the cloud. They offer their Skype for Business, which is the video conferencing communication tools. They offer SharePoint. They offer all of the Office apps and storage in the cloud in their data centres. And in fact, we're just about to roll it out, although a slightly cheaper SKU than this one. So Office 365 is happening everywhere, and there's a lot of large organisations doing it. I was having a discussion with a chat the other day that had rolled out 3,000 seats to the cloud, and they were very happy with the way it worked, and they'd used E5. But the E5 SKU is all of the standard stuff you'd imagine, like SharePoint, Skype for Business, the applications, Outlook, all of that. And it includes also what they call in their Compliance Centre element. And the Compliance Centre element is their first rollout of the Equivio technology. And their play clearly is geared towards what they see as a very attractive market. So their view is that it's a $65 billion market. And as Microsoft do, they're constantly looking at how they evolve their market, grow their market share, grow their revenue numbers, and increase their share price. So within this Compliance Centre, they're targeting that market with a real focus on eDiscovery and compliance to sell the platform, so to drag people in. So it's effectively another reason for people to move everything off their premises onto Microsoft's cloud. And having just gone through the process, the ROI is pretty strong. Even for us as a relatively small operation in Microsoft land with 300 people, it makes a lot of sense for us financially, stacked up with a 5-year total cost of ownership, to put in E3. E5 is more than double that in price, which would be a bit more difficult. But the practical reality is this is real. I mean, I didn't buy Microsoft E3 with any other view other than to save money and make our business work a bit better. So if someone small like me is buying it, then the value proposition is strong, and over time this is going to become, in my view, a very, very major part of the market. Now that means a whole lot of things for us, right? Firstly, it means that, well, a company might say, you know what, we've got the Equivio piece in there, we can do what we need to do to a certain extent. So on one hand you could argue that, well, that may shrink our market. On the other hand, you've got the ability to extract all the data out. You've still got large clients that want to outsource all of that risk and that process to those that do it a lot. So it could potentially grow our market as well. And I note that large outsourcers like HP, I was chatting to a project director at HP just recently, and he said they're pushing on to most of their clients because it just stacks up. It's going to be big. The interesting part for me is how K-Cura, and I suspect FTI and all of the major players will be addressing this, is to really engage and get as close to this process as possible so that they can work out the best way to leverage it. But for me, this is a really interesting development, and one that I think will, over time, really affect our market significantly. Okay, I just put this up here just to say that Microsoft are really pushing into that sort of EDRM model. So I guess their vision of the world is they sort of push into that EDRM model market and push, to a certain extent, vendors and service providers a bit further to the right. Of course, we don't want that. We're going to be doing what we can to maintain our position in that market. But nonetheless, for me, a very interesting play from Microsoft. Now, the other thing that those of you that recall when SharePoint came out 15, 20 years ago, there was a real fear that from document management vendors like the OpenText and the iManagers and the FileNets and the like, that SharePoint was going to kill the market. There was a real prevailing fear at the time. But essentially what happened is it created an incredibly good platform to actually put in a tool that works well. And I suspect that this may be the case with the E5 SKU, that Microsoft will do some of it okay, but when it comes to the real hardcore stuff and you've got a massive claim and you really don't want to take on any risk, that's when at least you've got a taste for it. You go, you know what, we could do this better. We've already had a sense of the technology. Let's go use a service provider or go straight to a vendor or whatever. So I actually think that overall it's a massive change and a very interesting change, but ultimately one that's positive for the market. Okay, so survival of the fittest. I was thinking, how do we identify in our market who is the fittest? Well, there's not a whole lot of analysis on the service side. The only real place that you can look is someone like the Gartner Magic Quadrant, the evil Gartner Magic Quadrant, which I've always had a bit of a problem with. But I thought I'd put it up there just for the sake of it being there. Interestingly, though, Gartner have decided to stop updating the Magic Quadrant such that it exists today, because really we're representing here $2 billion of a $10 billion market if we're talking about eDiscovery. So it's lost, in their views, a fair bit of its relevance. I was always relatively cynical about this anyway, because often it was the person who had the most dynamic and charismatic CEO that could work their magic on the Gartner consultants that created these things that got pushed further up to the top right. And who better than a great MD or CEO to really communicate that completeness of vision? But they're now going to be changing that to have multiple Magic Quadrants which look at different aspects of the market. So I think over time the way they're changing their approach to the market will be much more beneficial to you as service consumers when you're looking at acquiring new technology or using this for other reasons, or convincing your clients that they're good companies to use if they want to use the technology. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the cloud, and this is another sort of big piece of the disruption, for want of a better term, that's happening at the moment in our space. Amazon have phenomenal growth and phenomenal revenues, $8 billion growing at 80% a year. There is a view at the moment that the public cloud will reach $191 billion by 2020. That is an extraordinary market. 10 trillion objects stored in Microsoft Azure. Microsoft investing massively in that market. And Microsoft have got 1 million servers hosted in their data center, and with these SKUs, these Office 365 SKUs that people are taking up, their data centers are just exploding in size. So it's a huge shift. We currently have our own data center in Australia, but we use the cloud regionally. So if we need to spin up an instance of one of our platforms, be it Relativity or what have you, we'll put it into Azure in whatever country we need to go. And that in itself in our market creates its own problems, right? If I've got somebody that wants to have a look at our security in Australia, and probably a lot of you in this room have been involved in the bank advice matters going on, the bank bill swap rates. I mean, there's some a lot of highly sensitive matters that the banks are super sensitive about. And so we've done a couple of those, and they want to go and feel the data center. They want to know what's going on, have a look at your servers and your racks, and understand that what it takes to get in there. We did a matter recently in Azure in Singapore where the client wanted to do exactly that, which we're quite familiar with. Microsoft wouldn't even tell us where the data center was. Now we could work it out. There's ways of finding that out through forums and what have you, but they wouldn't allow our clients to actually go on site to have a look at that. So there's obviously a leap of faith in those scenarios. So that creates its own problems. The benefits, of course, of the cloud is we can spin instances up quickly, and all vendors have got that benefit. We've invested a huge amount of money in our data centre in Sydney, but to set that up in another region would, again, cost a lot of money, a lot of time, and we're not there. So for us to spin an instance up in China or Hong Kong or wherever is fast and very cost effective. Clearly, there's scaling benefits in the cloud. And whilst we've got a decent infrastructure, every time we want to update that significantly, we have to go and buy new hardware to expand our virtualised capability. The other issue that we've seen, and I've spoken to vendors at various times, is that, and we've seen it as well with the things that we put in the cloud, there is still that lack of hardcore performance that you need when you're doing a big matter on Nuix, where you need the best disk you can afford and the huge number of processors and absolute system performance maximised to get the outcomes that you need in the time that you need them. In the cloud, to date, we're still struggling to get that performance. In fact, anywhere near that performance. So even buying all the bells and whistles and spin my propeller for a moment, buying the SSD disks and high bandwidth and Express route, Microsoft Express routes to get data in and out, it's still nowhere near today as effective as doing either an on-premise install or, in our case, our own data centre, where we own everything that's sitting in there. And I suspect all vendors or all service providers are in the same boat in that regard. And as I say, I've talked about the limitation for security audits. Okay, so SaaS, software as a service. We're a SaaS provider for Relativity, for Transform, for Transcend, for a whole range of different products. And according to Gartner, that it's really contributed in varying degrees across the enterprise software market. Certainly for us, it's been a great thing for our business. The worldwide market for SaaS software application will be $33.4 billion. And, you know, not confusing SaaS with the cloud specifically, but obviously our SaaS is on our private cloud, which I guess to a client becomes a public cloud when you look at the varying definitions. But it's certainly a big market. I briefly wanted to talk about use cases because I still believe that our role as a vendor in this market is to create usable use cases. Now, I'll ruffle a couple of software company feathers here probably, but there's often this notion of creating an idea that exists in software. Without, in my view, the full process and the full workflows to support that use case, the use case is kind of dead in the water. But we are seeing some positive things around information governance, and for those of you who are old, not as old as Ian, because you did reference that in your speech, will remember information governance was a big thing 15 years ago when everybody was talking about iManage and Open, Docs Open and PC Docs and all those things. They were pitching themselves as information governance tools. A whole lot of businesses sprung up around information governance audits, etc. It kind of died away. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic about the notion of information governance in today's age because I've seen it come and go in the past. However, it makes perfect sense that our market moves into that space because of the technology. Now, again, it comes back to our ability to create a sustainable use case and proselytise that effectively to the market. The big one that I've seen bouncing around at the moment is cyber incident response. I'm sure people will talk about that over the rest of today. We haven't specifically done anything around that, but I think it's quite an interesting use case of the technology. And of course, forensic investigation is another big area. Okay, so my view again on our market is that it is a service-led, technology-supported market. And it's all well and good to have the best technology, but if you can't deploy it effectively, either on premises or through a supplier, then you're dead in the water. And so for me, the key elements of the eDiscovery market and the use of technology are around how it's delivered. So what is the availability? You know, have you got 3, 4 nines in your data centre? What is the QA of the outcomes? And do you have the knowledge to effectively QA it if you're doing it yourself? What is the security? And you know, what is the security of an Azure data centre? You'd have to hope it's pretty good, of course, because they're big and they've got a lot of money and spend a lot of time doing it. But how do you assess that if you don't necessarily have access to the details about how they run their setups? And then, of course, around liability and culture, and I guess all service providers in the space, I'm drawing a bit of a bow here, would have a pretty healthy professional indemnity insurance policy sitting behind them. So there's somebody to go after in that instance. Obviously, when you're throwing things into the cloud, you've got to be cautious about where your liability sits and if there's any sort of proportional liability that can be applied where something goes wrong. And let's be frank, in the nature of what we do and the number of documents that we process, mistakes get made. Everybody makes them. The person who says that they don't, they're lying or they've processed only a tiny amount of data. Now, we work out in a month we can process up to 100 million individual pieces of data. That might be TIFF files, PDF pages, scan pages, copied pages. It's massive. So you think about a percentage point of a percentage point of a percentage point error rate, there's still some errors there. So I think practically we've got to be looking at this from that sense. The last thing, and the thing that I think is most important in terms of how we deliver effective solutions in this space, is around culture. And the culture of whoever you're engaged with, or the culture of your team in the case of an in-house counsel team that might be doing some of this directly, or the culture in the case of a litigation support group within a law firm, is absolutely critical. And I'd say, generally speaking in Australia, and again, generalising massively, but it seems like there's a pretty good culture generated right across the industry. I've spent a bit of time in the US and the UK and throughout Asia, and it's not always that consistent. But certainly Australia is pretty good, but the culture for me is absolutely number one in terms of making sure that our technology works, that we are delivering effectively as part of the legal process. Ian talked about some of the rulings in the US and the UK and Ireland around use of technology and computer-assisted review. I think we should all be challenging ourselves over the next day to get Australia on that map. When are we going to get some judicial support for the use of technology in our market? And look, you know, I'm looking at myself here and going, I haven't done a very good job so far either, but I urge all of you, when the opportunities arise, to really take hold of them. And if you can influence the judiciary, if you can have some influence in pushing the use of technology to the judiciary or on any platform that will be helpful in getting us on that map. And when I have the dot there, I'm also talking more broadly in Asia, but I thought, given that we're in Sydney, I'd go with Sydney. But that's the challenge, gauntlet thrown. Going to finish with a quote from George Bernard Shaw. People who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. On that note, I thank you.